This is part 2 of the fall of feudalism. On the last lecture, we looked at the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages and feudalism, and we looked at the Holy Roman Emperor, who was neither holy nor Roman nor an emperor. And in this lecture, we are starting off with a look at the Black Plague and how it occurred and how it also led to the change in Europe, population-wise, that would bring about the final end of the Middle Ages and set the stage for the rise of the Renaissance. So the Black Death is, to this point, the most devastating natural disaster in European history. It killed more people and changed society in Europe more than any other natural disaster. We now know that the Black Death was carried by rats. It was the fleas that were infected with the bacteria that lived off the rats that caused it, though they had no clue as to how it was conveyed at the time. We also know that it started in Sicily, in Italy, in 1347, and then eventually spread by ship and by land throughout all of Europe. The Black Death is also called the bubonic plague. The term bubonic comes from, or originates from, the term for bubos, which are blisters. They get rather large, and they're irritated and swollen, and they appear initially in armpits and groins and then spread to other parts of the body. They were extremely uncomfortable, and it made this mysterious disease even more chilling because of how it began to manifest itself. We know that the disease itself followed the trade routes because it was spread by rats, and the rats also would hide out on ships as they followed food that was being transported back and forth, and that ultimately we have about 38 million people that died in Europe, and that is out of a beginning number of 75 million. So more than half of the population died from the plague in a relatively short period of time. The images on the screen show exactly where the plague comes from. So it's a bacteria that lives inside a flea. The bacteria is the one that does the damage. The flea carries the bacteria, but the flea also has to eat. So the flea feeds on the blood of rats, and the disease will actually kill the rat. So the flea infects the rat with the bacteria as it feeds on it, and when the rat dies, then the flea has to find a new host. So it will jump from rat to rat, but it will also jump from rat to person. And so the fleas leave the dead rats, especially if you happen to pick one up, that brings you in close proximity of where the fleas are, and they will jump from the dead rat onto you, the person, and then feed on you and transfer the bacteria from their system into your bloodstream, and that's what gets you. That's when the plague begins to manifest. This disease cycle, you can start with the flea drinking the rat's blood that carries the bacteria in the top left-hand corner, because the rat will get infected, and then any other flea that feeds on the rat will also get infected. Then moving to the top right, the bacteria multiply in the flea's gut, so it grows. The flea gets this bacteria, and then when it bites a human and regurgitates that blood back into the human's wound, that's when the human gets the disease. There are 3 forms of the bubonic plague. The first form is pneumonic. Right? So in the pneumonic phase of the bubonic plague, first it settles in your lungs. There's a lot of coughing, a lot of sneezing, heavy, intense chest pain, and then with the coughing, the person will begin to cough up blood. The second form of the bubonic plague is septicemic. It is the most rarely seen, but it also is the most lethal. It is in the blood, travels in the blood. You start to notice black spots beneath the skin, and then as the blood erupts and gets into the victim's lungs, then they start choking. Essentially, they're drowning in their own blood. It's extremely painful. It's an extremely painful way to go. And that's why the septicemic form of the bubonic plague is the deadliest. Right? There's little to no way to alleviate the pain and the accumulation of blood in the lungs. The third form is the bubonic. So this is the one that is the most common. It's the one that the song is about, right? Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. So you have the egg-sized swelling on the body that's eventually turn into rather dark blisters. There's a lot of vomiting, a lot of nausea, a lot of headaches and weakness that limits person's ability to move or to take care of other people. They're usually bedridden. And it's also accompanied by extreme fever, very, very high fever, and a loss of orientation, what we call delirium. So there's this, essentially you begin to lose touch with reality. Now, these three forms of the plague were sometimes seen as three different punishments or diseases, and so it took a long time for anyone to really be able to determine what was causing the plague. The length of time that it took to actually determine the cause also allowed it to spread. So you'll see on the map and the trade routes that are part of that, that the disease spread starting in December of 1347, right, with the dark green, and then we move through 1348 and 1349 and 50 and 51. Right? And there were only, on the entire map of Europe, right, and what we're looking at from Constantinople all the way to England, there are only a few places where there was almost no occurrence of the plague. One of the effects of the plague, and we mentioned this when we were doing our castle project, is that they would occasionally take body parts of people who had died from the plague and throw it over the walls of cities that were under siege. So people who were stuck inside, they couldn't leave, no one could go in, no one could come out. And so they tried to infect the people inside the city by throwing infected body parts from the plague into the castle itself. This early form of biological warfare or bacterial warfare usually wiped out everybody in the castle because people were so packed together. That meant that there was no place you could go that you weren't close to someone who potentially had the disease, and thus increasing your chances of actually getting it. Biological warfare is at least investigated, if not practiced, by most major military powers today. So not just nuclear and chemical, but biological as well. The effects of the Black Death, of the bubonic plague, is that overall about a third of the population died, sometimes as much as 50 to 60%, depending on the location. Crowded cities definitely suffered more than the countryside. Nobody really knew why the disease spread. It seemed to attack everybody. Initially, disease was thought to be a punishment for sin, and so the expectation was that a bad person would get the bad disease and die, and a good person wouldn't. But it didn't work out that way. Good and bad people of the church got the disease, and so people began to have a decrease in faith. They couldn't understand why, if you were good, you got the disease, and there seemed to be no benefit of being good because you got the disease. And so people stopped being as determined to practice their religious faith. It also increased anti-Semitism because, at least at one point, they believed that the disease was caused by Jewish people who were poisoning water wells, and some Jewish people were actually killed because of this suspicion, which of course later proved to be false. Another consequence was that there was a shortage of workers. Because so many people died, there weren't enough people to do the work, and so being a peasant was a position that was more in demand, and so they got more. Right? There wasn't a surplus of workers, which makes workers inexpensive or cheap. There were very few workers, and so because of the increase in demand, their value increased, and they became more economically mobile. They could take money and go somewhere else and get paid more for their work. And then if they didn't like that work, they could go somewhere else and probably get more than what they were working for before. That was something that was not possible before the massive amounts of death from the plague. So it's a positive that comes out of this huge decrease of population. On the right-hand side, you'll see there's a little bit of a timeline, right? So the estimated population of Europe from 1000 to 1352. And so you can see that the population is increasing from 38 million to 48 million to 59 million, 70 million, 75 million, and then between 1347 and 1352 it drops back down to approximately 50 million people. We don't know exactly how many people were alive at any one time. These are estimates, which is why they're rounded to the million. But people didn't have driver's licenses. There weren't always like birth certificates. Sometimes churches would just write the names of people that were born in a Bible. But if a child died at a very young age, a lot of times it wasn't even recorded. So there was really no way to get a really accurate number of the overall population of Europe. But you can see that we have a huge decrease between 1347 and 1352 of about 25 million people. This map is much more recent, so this is the world distribution of the plague in 1998, cases where countries reported the plague, and then areas where the plague was also found to occur in animals. This map shows the reported cases of the human plague in the United States between 1970 and 2012. And then this map shows the reported plague cases by country between 2000 and 2009. So you can see that even though the plague was the most prolific in the 1300s, that it has still not gone away. This is just a screenshot of a recent article about the plague. You can very easily Google bubonic plague and hit news, do a search in Google News for bubonic plague, and find lots of articles. You don't have to worry about reading this. It's just an example that you can consistently find modern cases of the plague. What we're going to look in the next section is the Great Schism, and this division in the Catholic Church between French Catholics and Italian Catholics. And that's where we're going to go next.